Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's IC Realtime webinar. In today's webinar, we will be discussing cybersecurity. This is going to be cybersecurity that pertains to our industry and how we can better protect our cameras and recorders from threats. I have muted everyone's microphone, but I will unmute everyone's microphone at the end of the webinar to field any questions anyone might have. My name is Michael Caballero. I'm one of the national sales executives here at IC Realtime, and let's get started. So in this webinar, we're going to be discussing physical security. Then we're going to be talking about enabling and disabling of essential and non-essential services. And then we're going to talk about networking. So first, we're going to talk about how to create a more security system. Cybersecurity is more than just a buzzword. It's something that pertains to every device that is connected to the internet. And IP video is not immune to any cyber risks. But taking a few steps toward protecting and strengthening networks and network appliances will make them less susceptible to attacks. So first, let's talk about physical security. When it comes to physical security, one thing we can talk about is connecting IP cameras to the PoE ports on the back of an NVR. Now, this is going to be twofold here. When you're using the integrated PoE switch on a recorder, that integrated PoE switch is isolated from the local area network. So there won't be access to the recorder on that local area network. Now we've done a few more things to protect the cameras and recorders when it comes to this. First is going to be minimum 8-character passwords, and then there's an initialization process when it comes to adding cameras to the recorder using the integrated PoE switch. Now, also, if you're not using a recorder, one of our recorders with an integrated PoE switch, you can also use the secondary NIC card on the recorder. That secondary NIC card is going to remove those cameras off the local area network. So though if someone has access to that LAN, they won't be able to reach those cameras because those cameras are indeed off that local area network on their own subnet. We have recorders with dual NIC cards. We also have recorders with quad NIC cards to keep those cameras, and not only for security measures, but also keep the load of those streams off that local area network. So you really do want to use those secondary NIC cards, or you want to make sure that you are using that integrated PoE switch. Now, also, very simply, physically lock down the device. There's a few ways that you can physically lock down a recorder from physical access. Of course, a lockbox, which you can get here at icrealtime.com for any of our recorders. Also in a locking server rack as well, or in a room that is behind lock and key. Now, all of these generally are going to be utilized on a commercial install with a network administrator. For residential, you can do the same thing. You can utilize lock boxes. You can drill those lock boxes into the floor, just like you would something like a safe. Not only that, make some attempts to hide that recorder and not just place it easily accessible on a shelf somewhere in the residence. Now, you might be worried about how you'll be able to interface with the recorder. Well, you can use Smart ICRSS remote client software. That software you can load on any desktop or laptop, PC or Mac in the household, and they can utilize that to interface with the recorder for live view, playback, or more extended feature sets. So you can really nowadays hide that recorder in a location that's not easily found, so that way you can have some extra added security. Now we're going to talk about enabling and disabling of essential and non-essential services. Now, one thing we've done here is we've basically done many of these things for you as they come out of the box disabled, but you do want to make sure that you don't enable any of these services. So if you have to port forward, utilize HTTPS and create an SSL certificate. This can all be done on IC real-time recorders and IP cameras. So if port forwarding is necessary, you do want to make sure that you use a secure HTTPS. That's what the S in HTTP stands for. I do not recommend port forwarding HTTP. And as a matter of fact, I don't recommend port forwarding at all. P2P is a fantastic service, much more secure than port forwarding, as you're not opening any ports to allow access to the recorder. Now, you do want to enable your IP filter as well if you want to prevent anyone from gaining access to the recorder. So you can whitelist or blacklist IP addresses on a local area network. This is more useful for your commercial installs, especially managed networks, where you're going to have multiple users on the network. Many times the user will attempt to locate access to the recorder. And if you're using an IP filter to filter out all of those IP addresses that cannot have access to the recorder, and only give access to any of the people on the network that should have access, whether it's going to be executives, C-level executives, or the network administrator. Now, disabling UPnP, this is already disabled on IC real-time recorders. You want to make sure not to enable it. UPnP stands for Universal Plug and Play, and basically it will port forward. If UPnP is on the router, it will port forward all of the ports available in the port list. And this is not something that you want. So you do want to make sure that you don't enable UPnP on our IC real-time recorders, and that you leave that disabled. Now, again, P2P is what I highly recommend to utilize for port forwarding. There's no known really vulnerabilities there. However, if you're not using P2P for whatever reason, go ahead and just disable it. Now, next is going to be disabling Snmp. Again, this is disabled out of the box, so it's not something you have to worry about. However, if you have to do any kind of trace routing, then you'll want to enable Snmp, so that way you can locate the camera on the LAN, especially if you cannot find that with the given IP address. Now, if you're done with your testing and trace routing, you do want to make sure that you then disable Snmp, as it does leave open a vulnerability. And then next is going to be multicast. Now, multicast is used to share streams between two or more recorders on a local area network. There's really not any known vulnerabilities, but again, if you're not using multicast for any reason, you want to make sure that it's disabled. It is disabled again out of the box. You just want to make sure that you do not enable multicast if you don't intend to use it. Now, when it comes to networking, one of the main things you want to do is isolate your NVR and IP camera network. Now, there's tons of ways to do that. You can use a VLAN. You can, again, put that on its own isolated local area network, which, again, a VLAN would do. VLANs, you can create a virtual LAN. You can have all of your IP addresses available to you. And then you can set permissions on who can access that virtual local area network. This is something that is generally done on managed switches. So you want to make sure, if you intend to create a VLAN, that you are using a managed switch to do so. If you don't know how, generally you can either do research to create a VLAN. It's not very difficult. And you can also, if you're installing on a managed network, you can also have the network administrator, who should be very proficient in creating VLANs, create one of those for you. So again, you can minimize access to your NVR and your IP camera. In the beginning of this webinar, we talked about just isolating the cameras. Using a VLAN is a way that you can isolate your NVR and your IP cameras all together. Now, this is something that used to be of great importance, especially when port forwarding, which was much more popular, but you want to make sure that your end user understands password protecting the router, right? If it's especially for you're not really going to run into this on managed networks and commercial installs, but you may run into this many times on residential installs. So one thing that is important is that most routers and router/modems have a browser-based interface with access to that router. Now, when I was in tech support, I wouldn't even attempt to ask for the username and password, because 95% of the time, when it came to routers or router/modems, either purchased by the end user or installed by the internet service provider, the browser-based access username and password would be set to default. I would try the default first. I would gain access, and I could port forward. So this is something that is important. Now, one thing that has, of the last few years, come along is internet service providers are not giving browser-based access anymore. If you want to port forward, generally now with internet service providers, you need to reach out to that internet service provider and you need to ask them to port forward for you. Again, P2P, you can get around all of this. You don't have to port forward. You don't have to create a DDNS. So P2P really is the way to go in terms of secure remote access. Now, if you do have to port forward, you may want to change the default TCP and UDP ports. The reason you want to change those TCP and UDP ports, which is all you need to port forward if you have to port forward. You don't need to port forward HTTP, especially that you have a replicated interface in Smart ICRSS remote client software that will allow you to troubleshoot any issues or make any configuration changes both locally and remotely. So you don't really need HTTP access anymore for remote troubleshooting. However, TCP really is the port that you need to change. Now, TCP port on our recorders, on our cameras is 37777, and on our recorders, 32789. This is something that you can find on the internet very easily. So you have 1,025 to 65,535 port numbers available that you can change the TCP port to on the recorder and then port forward that corresponding port. And again, so forward only the ports you need. So this is kind of reiterating what I just talked about. Make sure if you have to port forward, you only forward the TCP port, and if you need the UDP port as well. Never put a device into the demilitarized zone of a router. You just simply need to port forward those specific ports again, or use P2P. Now, next is disabling auto login on Smart ICRSS, and also to go even further, adding a password to ICRSS Pro or ICView, our mobile applications. So by default, when you install Smart ICRSS remote client software, it's set to auto log into Smart ICRSS. So what that means is your end user double clicks on their icon on their desktop, and it auto logs into Smart ICRSS, makes it really convenient. However, you want to disable this, especially for security conscious end users, as then it will prompt them to put in the username and password every time they open the software. Do keep in mind, you don't want, and an end user doesn't want, if their laptop or desktop is stolen and accessed, to have anyone with malicious intent use their installed security cameras against them. Same thing for commercial installs as well. You can also create a password for ICRSS Pro, our mobile application, as well as ICView. And in that, you can create a password. So every time the end user opens up on their tablet or on their mobile device, ICRSS Pro or ICView, it would prompt them for a password, giving you that added layer of security. Now, also, you do want to use a different username and password for Smart ICRSS, as well as ICRSS Pro and ICView, than you would typically use for other services like your email, banking, social media. The reason for this is there's tons of phishing schemes to find out username and passwords for people's again, social media, banking, for fraudulent activity here. And again, you don't want to use that same password because, again, if someone gains access to these services and they also attempt to do that with software installed on a mobile device or on a PC or Mac, then they're going to gain access to these security cameras that are installed for security, and again, use those security services that you have paid lots of money for and implemented to be used against you, to see when you're not at your home, you're not at your business, things of that sort. That's the last thing you want out of your security system that you invested to protect you. And then last thing is going to be make sure your firmware is up to date. You can find as a dealer or as a distributor of ours, if you have access to the dealer portal, you can find the latest firmware for recorders and IP cameras at this point. So I highly suggest that if you are a dealer of ours, that you do go and reach out to your sales executive and get access to the dealer portal. There's a tons of services that you can utilize in the dealer portal, and firmware updates are one of them. So do keep that in mind as well. And then lastly, make sure you check the log. If you suspect any intrusion into IC real-time recorders, then you want to make sure that you check those log entries so you can see where they've been in the recorder, what's been accessed, and even see if there's an IP address attached to that entry that you thought was suspicious. So now what I'll do is I'll take any questions anyone might have. I do ask that if you have any questions, you go to the top of your Zoom meeting, you go to the Q&A tab, you can drop your questions in there, and I'll be more than happy to answer those questions. Lewis, great question. So P2P, first of all, doesn't require you to port forward. And of course, DDNS and port forwarding are kind of work in tandem with each other. DDNS is not a different method of remote access. It just helps when you're port forwarding to give you a domain name. So port forwarding is opening up ports to your router and to your local area network for remote communication. P2P does not require that port forwarding. It is a server on the cloud, and that server for us is located using Amazon AWS. The person with the intent to gain access to the recorder would require, of course, username and password, which with IC Realtime, username and password on our recorders and cameras requires an 8-character minimum password. And then they would also need to know the serial number of the recorder. So there's a lot more protection there in terms of what is required for access to P2P than port forwarding. Now, do keep in mind, if someone had the time and the inclination, anything can be accessed. So that's something to keep in mind there. But P2P is by far more secure than port forwarding at this juncture. Roger, does IC Realtime provide any listing of recommended network gear? Not necessarily. Our cameras and recorders work with basically any switch out there, any routers out there. It's just a matter of specifying, like I mentioned, if you're going to do something like a VLAN for remote access or even a VPN, you want to make sure that you have a managed switch. You want to make sure that you have a quality VPN service, but any of them will suffice. Well, it looks like no one else has any questions at this time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on today's IC Realtime webinar. My name is Michael Caballero. I'm one of the National Sales Executives here at IC Realtime. Have a fantastic day and stay safe.